In the scorching heat of an August morning in 1514, two empires stood poised to clash in what would become one of history's most decisive battles. On the plains of Chaldiran, where the earth would soon run red with blood, the fate of the entire Middle East hung in the balance. This was not merely a contest between armies, it was a collision between two visions of Islam, two concepts of empire, and two leaders whose ambitions would reshape the world for centuries to come. The thunder of hooves echoed across the barren landscape as tens of thousands of warriors prepared to write history in steel and fire. On one side stood the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, commanding over 100,000 disciplined soldiers armed with the most advanced weapons of their age. Across the field, Shah Ismail of the Safavid Empire rallied his fearsome Qizilbash cavalry, warriors who believed their leader possessed divine power and that victory was their destiny. What followed would determine not only which empire would dominate the region, but which form of Islam would prevail across vast stretches of the Middle East. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded at Chaldiran, we must first journey back to the chaotic world of the early 16th century. The Middle East was a powder keg of competing ambitions, religious fervor, and imperial dreams. Two rising powers had emerged from the ashes of older empires, each claiming divine mandate, and each determined to expand their dominion at the expense of the other. In the West, the Ottoman Empire had transformed from a small Anatolian principality into a formidable force that struck fear into the hearts of European monarchs. Constantinople had fallen to their cannons in 1453, and their armies had pushed deep into the Balkans, threatening the very gates of Vienna. The Ottomans represented Sunni Islam in its most militant and organized form, wielding state-of-the-art military technology alongside unwavering religious conviction. But rising in the east was a power equally determined and perhaps even more dangerous. The Safavid Empire had exploded onto the scene in 1501 when a 16-year-old boy named Ismail claimed the throne of Persia and declared himself Shah. This was no ordinary conquest. Ismail and his followers were adherents of Shia Islam, a minority sect that had been persecuted and suppressed for centuries. Now, suddenly, they possessed an empire and the means to spread their faith across the region. The religious dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. For nearly 900 years, Sunni Islam had dominated the Middle East, with Shia communities existing as scattered minorities, often forced to practice their faith in secret. The Safavid revolution changed everything. Ismail did not merely conquer territory. He systematically converted entire populations to Shia Islam, often through force, creating a vast Shia heartland where none had existed before. This transformation sent shockwaves through the Sunni world. The Ottomans, who saw themselves as the guardians of Orthodox Islam, viewed the Safavid rise as nothing short of heretical rebellion. From their perspective, Ismail was not just a political rival but a dangerous sectarian revolutionary who threatened the very foundations of Islamic civilization. The man who would lead the Ottoman response was Sultan Selim I, known to history as Selim the Grim. Few rulers have ever embodied ruthless ambition quite like Selim. He had seized the throne in 1512 by deposing his own father and systematically eliminating potential rivals, including his own brothers and nephews. This was a man who understood that power demanded absolute commitment and that mercy was often a luxury that emperors could not afford. Selim recognized that the Safavid threat was unlike anything the Ottomans had faced before. Previous enemies had been Christians or traditional Muslim rivals who posed military challenges but did not threaten the religious unity of the Islamic world. The Safavids were different. They claimed to represent true Islam while denouncing the Ottomans as corrupt usurpers. Even worse, they were actively encouraging Shia uprisings within Ottoman territory, turning the empire's own subjects against their rulers. The situation became critical when Safavid agents began fomenting rebellion among the Turkmen tribes of eastern Anatolia. These nomadic warriors had always been difficult to control, but now they had a new rallying cry. Ismail presented himself not just as a temporal ruler, but as a messianic figure, the rightful leader of all Shia Muslims. His followers, known as the Qizilbash or Redheads for their distinctive crimson headgear, were fanatically devoted to their leader and absolutely convinced of his divine mission. In 1511, the simmering tensions exploded into open revolt. A massive Qizilbash uprising swept across southern Anatolia, led by a charismatic rebel known as Shakulu. Ottoman armies sent to suppress the rebellion were defeated, and for a terrifying moment, It seemed as though the empire's eastern provinces might slip away entirely. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it demonstrated the existential threat that Safavid ideology posed to Ottoman rule. The provocations continued to escalate. Ismail sent raiding parties deep into Ottoman territory, not merely to capture booty but to spread Shia propaganda and recruit new followers. He dispatched letters to Selim, filled with insults and theological challenges, questioning the Sultan's legitimacy and mocking his authority. In one particularly audacious gesture, Ismail sent Selim a gruesome gift, a drinking cup made from the skull of an Uzbek ruler he had defeated in battle. But perhaps the most inflammatory provocation came in the form of correspondence that revealed Ismail's contempt for his Ottoman rival. When Selim sent increasingly angry letters demanding that the Safavid raids cease, Ismail responded with a message that was both an insult and a challenge. Along with his letter, he sent a box of opium, implying that only someone under the influence of drugs could have written such poorly crafted prose. The message was clear. Selim was not merely a political enemy but an intellectual inferior, unworthy of serious consideration. For a man of Selim's pride and ambition, such insults could not go unanswered. The Sultan was not merely offended by Ismail's personal attacks. He was genuinely alarmed by the strategic threat that the Safavid Empire represented. If Ismail succeeded in converting the Turkmen tribes and establishing Shia strongholds throughout Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire's eastern frontier would become permanently unstable. Worse still, the religious authority that underpinned Ottoman rule would be fatally undermined. The decision for war was not made lightly. Ottoman military campaigns required enormous resources and careful planning. The eastern frontier was harsh and unforgiving, with difficult terrain and limited supplies. Previous sultans had focused their energies on expansion into Europe, where the rewards were greater and the logistics more manageable. But Selim understood that the Safavid threat had to be confronted before it grew beyond control. Throughout 1513, the Sultan began assembling what would become one of the largest armies in Ottoman history. Over 100,000 men were gathered from across the empire's vast territories. Elite Janissary infantry formed the core of the force. Disciplined soldiers, armed with the latest firearms and trained in the most advanced military tactics of their age. Supporting them were thousands of Sipahi cavalry, engineers, artillery specialists, and support troops. The technological superiority of the Ottoman military machine was staggering. While European armies were still adapting to gunpowder weapons, the Ottomans had perfected their use. Massive bronze cannons capable of reducing fortress walls to rubble were transported on specially designed carriages. Hundreds of smaller field guns provided tactical flexibility on the battlefield. Most importantly, thousands of Janissaries carried matchlock muskets that could deliver devastating volleys of fire with unprecedented accuracy and range. As winter gave way to spring in 1514, the great Ottoman war machine began its ponderous advance eastward. The logistics of moving such a massive force across the Anatolian plateau was staggering. Thousands of pack animals carried supplies, ammunition, and equipment. Engineers prepared roads and bridges to accommodate the heavy artillery. Supply depots were established at regular intervals to ensure that the army could maintain its momentum across the vast distances it would have to traverse. Word of the massive Ottoman advance spread like wildfire across the region. Merchants along the trade routes whispered of an army so vast that it darkened the horizon, while Kurdish chieftains weighed their loyalties as the thunder of war drums echoed from the west. For Shah Ismail, the moment of reckoning had arrived faster than anticipated. The young ruler who had swept to power on promises of divine mandate and Shia righteousness now faced the ultimate test of his claims. The Safavid response revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses that would define their empire's destiny. Ismail's forces were built around the Qizilbash, Turkmen warriors, whose ferocity in battle was matched only by their mystical devotion to their Shah. These men did not merely serve Ismail as soldiers serve a king. They worshipped him as a living saint, believing that his presence on the battlefield made them invincible and that death in his service guaranteed paradise. The Qizilbash military tradition was ancient and proud, rooted in the nomadic culture of the Turkmen steppes. These warriors were master horsemen who had learned to fight from the saddle before they could properly walk. Their preferred weapons were the curved shamshir sword, the composite bow, and the long lance, tools that had served their ancestors well in countless battles across the vast expanses of Central Asia. They wore the finest steel armor that Persian craftsmen could forge, and their horses too were protected by metal plates and mail. But the Qizilbash possessed something beyond mere military skill. They carried with them an unshakable belief in their divine mission. To them, Ismail was not simply a temporal ruler, but the manifestation of God's will on earth. This religious fervor gave them a courage that bordered on recklessness and a willingness to charge into seemingly impossible odds without hesitation. It had carried them to victory after victory as they carved out the Safavid Empire from the chaos of competing dynasties and tribal confederations. Yet this same mystical devotion contained the seeds of disaster. The Qizilbash viewed warfare as a test of spiritual purity rather than a matter of tactical calculation. They looked with contempt upon the new gunpowder weapons that were transforming battlefields across the world, seeing firearms as the tools of cowards who lacked the courage to meet their enemies face to face with steel. Honor and glory, they believed, could only be won through personal combat, sword against sword and man against man. As reports reached Tabriz of the approaching Ottoman host, Ismail faced a series of crucial decisions that would determine not only the outcome of the coming battle, but the future of his dynasty. His advisors urged caution, suggesting that the Safavid forces should avoid direct confrontation and instead rely on their superior knowledge of the terrain to wage a war of attrition. The harsh landscape of the Iranian plateau had defeated many invaders before, and winter was approaching when the Ottomans would be forced to retreat or face destruction in the mountain passes. But Ismail rejected such counsel. The young Shah was intoxicated by his own success and convinced of his divine protection. He had never been defeated in battle, and the Qizilbash had proved invincible whenever he led them personally. To avoid battle would be to show weakness, to suggest that he doubted his own divine mandate. Worse still, it would disappoint his followers who had come to expect miraculous victories under his leadership. The decision to give battle was compounded by a series of strategic errors that would prove catastrophic. Rather than defending the mountain stronghold of Khoi, which would have forced the Ottomans to assault prepared positions across difficult terrain, Ismail chose to descend to the plains of Chaldiran. This decision baffled his more experienced commanders, who understood that open ground would favor the enemy's superior numbers and artillery. But the Shah was determined to meet his enemies in the kind of glorious cavalry charge that had won him his empire. Meanwhile, Selim's advance had not been without its challenges. The Ottoman army was magnificent in its organization and equipment, but it was also a massive logistical burden that required enormous quantities of food, water, and ammunition. The Safavids had implemented a scorched earth strategy, destroying crops and poisoning wells along the Ottoman line of march. Villages were abandoned, livestock driven away, and anything that could aid the invaders was systematically destroyed. The harsh Armenian highlands tested even the discipline of the Janissaries. These elite troops were accustomed to comfortable garrison duty or brief campaigns in the relatively hospitable terrain of the Balkans. Now they found themselves marching across barren plateaus under a merciless sun, their heavy equipment weighing them down and their supplies running low. Discontent began to spread through the ranks as soldiers questioned the wisdom of pursuing a war against fellow Muslims in such unforgiving country. The situation became so tense that the Janissaries actually fired their muskets at the Sultan's tent in protest, a shocking breach of military discipline that demonstrated how close the army came to mutiny. Only Selim's iron will and the promise of imminent battle kept the expedition from disintegrating. When scouts reported that Ismail had finally decided to give battle at Chaldiran, the Sultan immediately ordered the advance, partly to engage the enemy and partly to restore his army's morale through action. As the two forces converged on the plains of Chaldiran, the contrast between them could hardly have been more dramatic. The Ottoman army was a marvel of military engineering, a disciplined machine designed to deliver overwhelming firepower with methodical precision. Their artillery train included over 200 heavy cannons, weapons capable of hurling iron balls with devastating effect. Behind barriers of chained wagons, thousands of Janissaries prepared their matchlock muskets for the coming slaughter. The Safavid host presented an entirely different spectacle. 40,000 Qizilbash warriors sat their horses in perfect silence, their red caps bright against the morning sun, and their steel armor gleaming like silver. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who had never known defeat, warriors who believed that divine favor would carry them through any trial. At their head rode Ismail himself, still only 27 years old but already a legend among his followers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. On one side stood the future, represented by gunpowder weapons, disciplined infantry, and the ruthless calculation of modern warfare. On the other waited the past, embodied by the ancient traditions of nomadic cavalry and the mystical fervor of religious warfare. When dawn broke on August 23rd, the world would discover which vision would prevail. The morning mist clung to the plains like a shroud as the two armies stirred to life. Across the field of Chaldiran, the sounds of preparation echoed in the pre-dawn darkness. Ottoman artillery crews checked their cannon charges, while Janissaries cleaned their muskets and whispered prayers. In the Safavid camp, Qizilbash warriors sharpened their curved swords and adjusted their armor, their red caps bobbing like drops of blood in the pale light. Shah Ismail had spent the night in meditation and prayer, convinced that this day would bring him his greatest triumph. His followers gathered around him in reverent silence as he spoke of divine favor and certain victory. The young Shah's confidence was absolute. Had he not conquered an empire before reaching his 20th birthday? Had the Qizilbash not proved unstoppable in every battle they had fought? The Ottomans might possess superior numbers and strange new weapons, but they lacked the spiritual purity that guaranteed success in holy war. Yet even as Ismail spoke words of encouragement, experience among commanders, his ranks felt growing unease. The flat terrain offered no advantages to cavalry, while the Ottoman position bristled with cannon and protected infantry. Some veterans quietly suggested a withdrawal to more favorable ground, but such counsel was dismissed as cowardice. The Shah had made his decision, and the Qizilbash would follow him into the fires of hell if necessary. Sultan Selim moved through his own ranks with grim satisfaction. The long march across the Armenian highlands had tested his army severely, but now they faced an enemy foolish enough to meet them on ground of the Ottomans' choosing. His artillery commanders reported that their guns were positioned and ready, while the Janissary officers confirmed that their men had adequate ammunition for a prolonged engagement. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The Sultan's strategy was methodical and brutal in its simplicity. The Safavid cavalry would charge, as cavalry always charged, seeking to break enemy lines through shock and momentum. But instead of meeting lances with lances in the traditional manner, the Ottomans would receive the attack behind prepared positions. Chained wagons formed a barrier that horses could not cross, while artillery and musket fire would thin the charging ranks before they could close. It was warfare transformed by technology, a new age of killing that made ancient heroics obsolete. As the sun climbed higher, both armies began their final preparations. Ottoman engineers made last-minute adjustments to their wagon barriers, ensuring that gaps between the vehicles were properly covered by overlapping fields of fire. Artillery crews loaded their cannons with chain shot and grape shot, devastating ammunition designed to cut down masses of charging cavalry. Behind the guns, ranks of Janissaries checked their powder and shot, their faces grim beneath their distinctive white caps. The Safavid deployment revealed both the strength and weakness of their military tradition. 40,000 mounted warriors arranged themselves in perfect formation, their discipline impressive even to enemy observers. These were not the disorganized tribal raiders that the Ottomans had faced in previous campaigns. The Qizilbash were elite troops, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, trained from childhood in the arts of mounted warfare. Each warrior was a master of his craft, capable of loosing arrows at full gallop or wielding lance and sword with devastating effect. Their horses were carefully bred for speed and endurance, selected from the finest bloodlines of the Central Asian steppes. The armor they wore represented centuries of Persian metalworking tradition, steel plates and mail that could turn aside most weapons while still allowing freedom of movement. But for all their individual skill and collective courage, the Qizilbash were about to face a tactical revolution they could not comprehend. Their entire military philosophy was built around the decisive cavalry charge, the thunderous assault that shattered enemy formations through pure kinetic force. They had no experience fighting disciplined infantry protected by firearms, no understanding of how artillery could dominate a battlefield. They were magnificent warriors preparing to fight yesterday's war. The first exchanges came not with the clash of steel but with a war of words that revealed the depth of hatred between the two sides. Selim sent a final ultimatum demanding Ismail's submission, a message delivered by envoys who rode fearlessly across the no-man's land between the armies. The Sultan's terms were characteristically brutal: complete surrender, conversion to Sunni Islam, and acknowledgement of Ottoman supremacy. Ismail's response was equally uncompromising. He rejected the ultimatum with contempt, declaring that he would rather die than bow to heretical usurpers. The Shah's message, delivered by his own brave messengers, contained theological arguments mixed with personal insults. He questioned Selim's legitimacy, mocked his military capabilities, and prophesied divine retribution for those who opposed the righteous cause. These ritual exchanges served a purpose beyond mere propaganda. They allowed both commanders to demonstrate their resolve to their own troops while giving final opportunities for intelligence gathering. Ottoman observers noted the Safavid deployment and estimated enemy numbers, while Safavid scouts studied the wagon barriers and artillery positions with growing concern. As the morning wore on, tension built to an almost unbearable level. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the approaching violence. Warriors on both sides made final preparations, checking weapons and armor one last time. Priests and imams moved through the ranks, offering blessings and absolution. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation as thousands of men prepared to kill or die for causes they believed were blessed by heaven. The signal for battle came not from any formal command, but from the irresistible momentum of events. A Qizilbash champion, overcome by religious fervor, spurred his horse forward in a solo charge toward the Ottoman lines. His cry of, "There is no God but God," echoed across the field as he galloped toward certain death, lance leveled and red cap streaming behind him. The lone warrior's charge served as the spark that ignited a conflagration. Seeing their comrade's courage, other Qizilbash spurred forward, unable to let him die alone. Within moments, what had been a disciplined formation dissolved into a thunderous avalanche of steel and horsehair as thousands of mounted warriors surged toward the Ottoman positions. The sound was unlike anything witnesses had ever experienced. The earth trembled under countless hooves, while the air filled with war cries in Persian and Turkish. Sunlight flashed off steel as 40,000 warriors bore down on their enemies with the fury of a desert storm. For those watching from the Ottoman lines, it must have seemed as though the very gates of hell had opened to disgorge an army of demons. Yet even as the magnificent Qizilbash charge gained momentum, experienced Ottoman officers felt no fear. They had seen cavalry charges before and knew their limitations. Behind their protective barriers, artillery crews made final adjustments to their aim while Janissaries brought their muskets to their shoulders. The range was closing rapidly, but everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The first Ottoman response came from the great bronze cannons positioned at key points along their line. The roar of artillery was deafening, drowning out even the thunder of approaching hooves. Clouds of white smoke billowed across the battlefield as iron balls and grapeshot tore bloody lanes through the charging cavalry. Horses and men tumbled in screaming heaps as the ancient art of war met the modern science of destruction. But the Qizilbash did not falter. These were warriors who had faced death 100 times and emerged victorious through courage and faith. The gaps torn in their ranks closed immediately as surviving riders pressed forward, their religious fervor transforming horror into holy rage. They had committed themselves to the charge, and nothing would turn them back. The slaughter intensified as the range decreased. Ottoman field guns joined the bombardment, smaller weapons that could be reloaded more quickly than the heavy siege pieces. Grape shot and chain shot swept through the Safavid ranks like invisible scythes, cutting down men and horses with mechanical efficiency. The carefully maintained formations began to dissolve as surviving warriors pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Still, the Qizilbash came on, driven by a courage that bordered on madness. Individual acts of heroism blazed briefly in the carnage as warriors leaped their horses over fallen comrades or charged directly into cannon mouths with their lances leveled. But heroism could not overcome physics, and courage could not stop iron balls traveling at tremendous velocity. The decisive moment came when the surviving cavalry reached the wagon barriers that protected the Ottoman infantry. Here, the technological revolution in warfare revealed its full implications. Traditional cavalry tactics assumed that determined horsemen could break any infantry formation through shock and terror, but the Ottomans had created something entirely new, a defensive system that channeled attacking cavalry into killing zones while protecting friendly troops behind impenetrable barriers. The chained wagons formed an obstacle that no horse could cross, while gaps between vehicles were covered by concentrated musket fire. Qizilbash warriors found themselves trapped in a nightmare of smoke and flame, unable to close with their enemies or retreat through the press of men behind them. Those who tried to wheel around the flanks discovered that Ottoman artillery could be repositioned quickly to cover new approaches. What followed was not so much a battle as a systematic execution. Janissary volleys cut down Safavid warriors by the hundreds, while artillery continued its methodical work of destruction. The elite cavalry that had conquered an empire found itself helpless before enemies they could not reach. Reduced to targets in an Ottoman shooting gallery, the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical slaughter. For generations, the Qizilbash had believed in their own invincibility, convinced that divine favor would carry them through any trial. Now they watched helplessly as their greatest warriors died uselessly against barriers of wood and iron, their courage meaningless in the face of superior technology and tactics. The dying light of that August day illuminated a field transformed beyond recognition, where 40,000 Qizilbash warriors had thundered across the plains in glorious formation. Now only scattered survivors stumbled through a landscape of carnage. The red caps that had given the elite cavalry their name lay trampled in the dust, their crimson color lost among the darker stains that would give Chaldiran its grim legacy. Shah Ismail himself, wounded and broken, retreated with barely 300 followers to a distant hill, where the mournful sound of his Sufi flute signaled the end of more than a battle. It marked the collapse of an empire's dreams and the shattering of a divine myth that had sustained the Safavid rise to power. The young Shah, who had believed himself invincible, would never again lead his armies in person, retreating into a decade of despair and drink that ended only with his death. But the true legacy of Chaldiran extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. In a single day, the religious and political map of the Middle East had been redrawn with lines that persist to this very moment. The Sunni-Shia divide that defines so much of modern Islamic geopolitics, the borders between Turkey and Iran, the sectarian conflicts that still rage across the region, all can trace their origins to that blood-soaked field where gunpowder weapons proved their supremacy over ancient valor. The Battle of Chaldiran stands as one of history's great turning points, a moment when the medieval world gave way to the modern age and when the dreams of empire collided with the harsh realities of technological change. In the end, courage was not enough. Faith could not stop cannonballs, and the future belonged to those who understood that war itself had been transformed forever.